we need to learn to speak to someone in a way in which we're taking responsibility for what we're feeling and what it is we're needing. And then maybe asking our partner if they're willing to give us something that we need, as opposed to what we normally do, which is speak in a way that unintentionally may come across as critical or demanding. And then things go off the rails from there.
Welcome to the Life Fulfilled podcast because life's too short not to experience fulfillment. I'm Bernie Borges, your host and the creator of the Fulfillment Centric Leadership Framework. No matter your age or stage, a more fulfilled life is on the table on the Life Fulfilled podcast. So pull up a chair and be sure to press that follow or subscribe button. Adele Curran, welcome to the Life Fulfilled podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation because it's a different topic than I've covered before. We're going to discuss the skills that someone might be missing for a thriving relationship. Skills, Adele? Skills? What's up with skills needed for a thriving relationship?
Well, what's up is that most of us don't have the skills we need to have a thriving relationship and they go off the rails. Rather than helping people or thinking I'm helping people by letting them continue their same old dynamics, I am really invested in helping them learn what they need so that they can have relationships that work.
So, what are the most common struggles in relationships?
Oh my goodness. There's so many. It's really common to talk about how communication is the key to relationships, right? And I have a similar philosophy, which is that, we so often struggle with communication, but the way I go about it is quite different from what you might typically hear or learn about. So, one thing, that we all struggle with is how to actually let somebody else know what it is that we're feeling, what it is we need. We struggle with listening and empathizing with each other. And so that's a major skill we're all missing is communication first and foremost. We're missing the ability to self-regulate. There are a lot of different ways, terminology you might use for this. A lot of us are missing the tools we need to regulate our emotions. And so that's something that people really have to be taught as well. And there's several others, but those are kind of the two buckets I put things in,
The
like the
big
emotional
ones.
regulation and then the communication.
Okay, before we actually get into the skills, I'm dying to have that conversation with you, Adele, and really understand what you mean by skills in a relationship. I know that you're a relationship and communication coach.
Right.
How did you get there? Give us your backstory.
Oh gosh. Well, I was married quite young, and I think my story is fairly typical in that after however many years, maybe 10 years, I became really dissatisfied with my marriage. I tried everything to get it back on track. I was the person who tended to be like the caregiver and the fixer. And I was, racing around trying to fix it. I read all the books. I dragged my husband to couples counseling, and ultimately nothing worked. And I wound up getting divorced. And then on the other side of that, now it's been almost 10 years, looking back, I can see what I was missing and what he was missing and what we were missing together to enable our relationship to work. And so now, it's my purpose really is to help give people what I didn't have and what he didn't have to help relationships actually thrive. So people don't have to go through what I went through.
Okay. You said that your story is fairly common, and it is. Unfortunately, it is. I do hear stories similar to that. And one thing that I've seen you say that I really want to commend you for, Adele, I really like what you say, and that is that you say, I'm not telling you to go, meaning I'm not telling you to leave your relationship, and I'm not telling you to stay. I'm telling you to figure out what's best for you. And
Mhm.
I really, really like that, and I really commend you for that. So let's use that as a segue to these skills. I want to understand these relationship skills. For a little context, Adele, you know that my five pillar life strategy is health, fitness, career, relationships, and legacy. So clearly, we're talking about the relationship pillar. So let's get into it. What are the skills that we need to build strong long lasting, meaningful relationships?
Yeah, so I will start with, and honestly, the way I talk about this has evolved and keeps evolving almost every week. So sometimes I use certain words, sometimes I use other words. So I would put I started off talking about emotional regulation. So the very first thing I help my clients with is kind of what to do with all the emotions they have that are difficult when they're in a relationship that's struggling. And I start there because I find that when people come to me, they are so angry, they're so resentful, maybe guilty, a lot of other emotions, sad, there are all kinds of emotions that could be going on that I really have to help people have a way of handling what's coming up for them because without that, things tend to go off the rails. And that's something that I really help them with on an individual basis, as opposed to I could potentially help them with it as a couple. But I find it's really effective to work with each person one on one. First of all, so that they can, and when I say regulate their emotions, I don't mean just staying calm all the time, being able to identify what's coming up, how they're feeling, learning what they actually need that's underneath the feeling, how to soothe themselves in the moment. And why is that so important? It's so important because let's say you get into an argument with your spouse, which is inevitable at some point, right? Are you going to lose it and start yelling? Or are you going to be able to center yourself and calm yourself? And that's so key. I mean, as we can all relate to, right? It's like when
Yeah.
I get upset, how am I going to handle myself?
Yeah.
So that's like the first thing I really help everybody with.
Okay, so just a little double click on that because you answered the question that was in my head on what you mean by regulation. And so, what I really think I'm hearing, Adele, is that you're really talking about self awareness, like being aware of the emotions that we can experience in our
Mm.
relationship and being aware of how to manage them.
Yeah, self-awareness, I actually just created this new document last week for my clients about what is emotional maturity is kind of like the overview. And I broke it down and really the first step is awareness, right? And that awareness is what you're talking about. What am I feeling? At what point do I need to pause and soothe myself? So awareness is really just the first part. And then the second part is the regulation. What do I do when I notice that I'm feeling upset or triggered or whatever you want to call it? And then there are these other components which actually come in later as part of the communication. How do I listen to someone else and have empathy for them, maybe even when I'm feeling upset? So it becomes very complex. But yes, awareness is the place to start.
Okay. And I think it's probably no accident that you're beginning with emotion, right? Because let's face it, relationships are emotional. So let's address that right out of the gate.
Yeah, you gotta address it right out of the gate. And so often when people come to me, I think you were asking about the major problems in relationships. People typically, by the time they've gone to see a couples counselor or to go to see me, they have a lot built up between them. And it usually looks like people often say it's like we have a wall between us. And what's that wall? It's a buildup of, you could call it resentment, a buildup of hurt, anger, sadness over time, and until they learn how to manage this difficult feeling that's there, that wall, then there's nothing really you can do to make it better.
All right. So the first skill then is emotional regulation. Okay. What's another skill that we need?
So we need this is an actual skill, even though it's kind of like a mindset thing too, which is the ability to take responsibility for our side of the equation. Self-responsibility, basically. And this is something that most all of us lack. We weren't taught how to do it. Most traditional couples counseling doesn't really go there. It becomes about listening to people argue and throw each other under the bus over and over again and blame. It becomes a blame game. So, what's so important to get out of that cycle of blaming each other is to learn to see clearly your own side of the equation. And it's a skill because, like I said, we weren't taught it. And so I have to, and this is something I have to very gently walk people into. Because the truth of the matter is it can be very easy, as we all know, to, see the plank in someone else's eye, you know, or the splinter, how did the saying go? In any case, it's
It's
easy
the
to see
plank.
someone.
It's the plank. It's biblical. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Pull the plank out of your own eye before
You
you
pull
put
the
it out.
plank. Yeah, 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 exactly. So it's so easy to see what someone else is doing, especially when you're with someone who might be doing something that's frankly kind of obnoxious. And yet there is always a part in which we're responsible. Maybe my responsibility is only that I've put up with this for a long time and I haven't learned how to stand up for myself. But there's always a piece in responsibility that lies with each of us.
Yeah, I think this is a big one because I think it's probably very common. You would know better than I as a relationship coach, but just speaking from my own life experience, Adele, it's probably pretty common for us to be looking that way. I think there's another old adage. It goes something like, if I'm pointing the finger at you, I'm pointing one finger at you, but there's three fingers pointing back at me. Right. So it's the old,
Yeah.
where do I have responsibility in this thing that I'm
Yeah.
frustrated by?
Absolutely. And it's actually a mindset I always had even during the marriage where I told you about that I was struggling. And I think some of us are naturally more self-reflective than others. I was always pretty self-reflective. I mean, I think that's why I like this work and I've always been drawn to personal growth work. But I didn't really have the ability to actually see my part. I would blame myself for things kind of generally without seeing where I had the opportunity to grow. And that's really why this is so important. It's not only that it stops the blame of the other person, it gives me an opportunity to make changes when I can see what part is my responsibility and what part isn't.
Okay. So we've covered emotional regulation. We've covered the skill of taking responsibility. What's next, Adele?
So this part isn't so much a skill, but I think it's so important in work with relationships. So I kind of think about it as like there are skills and then there is something that's deeper. And I think you and I talked about it when we first met, but as we all know, if you've done any degree of personal growth work or therapy or whatever, we're all carrying around an accumulated lifetime of junk, mainly that started in childhood. Those things that trigger you and those things that we all tend to believe things about ourselves that may not be helpful. And so there's a component of this work that's so important that we work on this deeper underlying, you could call it subconscious or unconscious stuff that we're all carrying around. And that work is so incredibly important because until we do it, we can learn skills and they might be useful, but the same old stuff tends to keep coming up until we work on that. So it's not a skill per se, but it's a really important part of the work.
So isn't that also another form of self-awareness then?
It is a form of self-awareness, but I would say it goes deeper than that because I would call like self-awareness might be so you can use self-awareness around your triggers, right? You can say, "Oh my goodness, oh, this old thing is coming up and I know this is old and I'm getting triggered and this is time I need to pause." Okay, so that's a self-awareness kind of strategy. Whereas if you're working really on this deeper subconscious layer, the idea is when I'm getting triggered, it's because of this old stuff is coming up and it's triggering this old belief about myself. Maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I'm not lovable or deserving or whatever. Then once we work on that on a deeper level, it may be that the trigger is still there somewhat, but it's going to be a lot less. So therefore, we won't tend to have the same emotional response when the something comes up.
So what do you call this? Because I have to tell you, the way that I'm framing this up in my mind, Adele, is I'm calling this know your baggage.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's about your baggage, but there's a big difference between being aware of your baggage and removing some of the baggage. So the idea is when you're working on it on a really deep level, it's not that it goes away entirely, but the baggage becomes a lot lighter.
Speaking for myself, because I can only speak for myself,
Mhm.
do I really know what my baggage is? Am I willing to go deep and think about it? Am I willing to bring it to the surface? You know what I mean? Like, how are people dealing with that on their own? I mean, I realize you work with people as a
Mhm.
relationship coach, but in general, I mean, why don't you speak to that?
Well, it's such a good question. I mean, well, first of all, there's the willingness, right? Of course, you have to be willing for anything to work. So the willingness, yeah, if you have to be willing for anything to work. But then willing and able are two different things. So even if you're willing to see your baggage, you might not be able to see it on your own. And that's where I come into play. And it can be difficult, even when I'm working with someone, to identify what that baggage is. But, I'm trained in this. So I'm actually trained in a type of deep subconscious work where if someone comes to me and, for example, says, "Here's my pattern. I tend to fly off the handle whenever my wife mentions, I don't know, let's say money. Whenever my wife spends more than I want her to at the grocery store, I fly off the handle, I scream and yell, I completely freak out. And this has been a pattern my whole life. I remember when I was a kid when my dad would do the same thing with my mom or whatever. So, what I could help that person do is once you can identify a pattern, then you have an entry point. Okay, now we can look at what to really work on. And I don't necessarily need to know what it is because when we do this type of deep subconscious work together, it basically all comes out. And it ends up being some kind of fear. So that person who flies off the handle about money might have grown up in a situation where they never had enough money and there was a lot of scarcity and they were always afraid. And so for that person, maybe the thing we need to work on isn't so much like their communication skills as it is his deep underlying fear of not having enough money. So once that fear becomes a little less, then he's not going to fly out the handle in the same way. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah. So, what I'm getting out of that is that it is deep. It is something that we have to come to understand at a very deep emotional level. And I still use the phrase baggage because it is something that we've carried with us for quite some time. We just may or may not be aware of it.
Totally, and we all have baggage. I mean, that's the thing. We all have it,
Yeah.
and in our closest relationships, that's when that old stuff comes out. When we're
Right.
single, and there's no one, bothering us and, we get to live in our little bubble, it's easy. And when we're living with someone, and we're committed to them, that is when people I don't know if you've heard this expression, relationships are a mirror. They're gonna end up showing us our stuff. They're gonna end up showing us what we need to work on.
Okay, so just to kind of keep flowing on the skills, we've talked about emotional regulation, taking responsibility, knowing your baggage, and having an awareness around that. What's
Yeah.
next? What's another skill you
So
need?
so so the broad skill, I would say, is this communication piece. And this all works together. You can't really separate these skills out because the emotional regulation cannot be separate from the communication. Because if you think about it, you can learn the right words to say, but if you're saying the words with an undertone of anger and resentment, it's just not going to work. There is a component of communication that I really have to teach people because we've never learned it about how to speak to someone in a way that is and this is actually reflecting back on the self-responsibility piece. We need to learn to speak to someone in a way in which we're taking responsibility for what we're feeling and what it is we're needing, and then maybe asking our partner if they're willing to give us something that we need, as opposed to what we normally do, which is speak in a way that unintentionally may come across as critical or demanding, and then things go off the rails from there. So the communication, it's multi-layered. It's regulating myself, it's taking responsibility, it's speaking in a way that takes responsibility, it's asking, not demanding. And then there's this other side of communication, which is all about how I'm going to listen to you, to my partner when you're upset, and learning to have empathy for what that other person's experiencing, even if, and this is the really hard part, I might want to become defensive or say, I didn't actually do that, or you're wrong, or. So that is something that really has to be taught. And once people learn it, it really up levels relationship. I know for me, it's been a game changer.
Yeah. So I was waiting for this one, Adele, because as you said, it's huge. And I kind of view it as overarching, right? Like it even is overarching emotional regulation and
Yeah,
taking responsibility and baggage because communication is part of that. I have always said that communication is the hardest thing we do in life. And I mean in life. And when you think about life, life is both in work and out of work, right? We spend a lot of time at work. So we're communicating, but we spend time, of course, outside of work. And nonetheless, it's no less important. And I've always said it's the hardest thing we do in life. And I like the fact that if I understand correctly, you're saying that part of communication is listening, knowing how to listen and engage in the communication process, not just outbound, but also inbound as well. Am I hearing that right?
absolutely. And I think when people talk about communication, they're usually thinking just about the outbound. What are the words I'm saying? And that, I mean, I would say it's even more important to develop the skill of the inbound. How am I going to be with someone else when they're in pain or when they are angry with me or when they have requests of me? And that part is absolutely huge. And you're right, it's probably one of the hardest things we do. And there's so much that goes into it. And we're constantly communicating. You and I are communicating right now. We
Hmm.
communicate with our children, with our coworkers. And here is something that most of us are missing. And this is where I start with all my clients. We're communicating constantly with ourselves. So, we have this little voice that's always talking to us, right? And sometimes there are two voices that are talking to each other. And that's where we have to start because until we can communicate with ourselves better, we can't really communicate with anyone else better either.
Yeah. There's a concept that I learned many years ago that has really been helpful to me on communication. And that is that there's two parts to it. There's sending and receiving. So, like you said, we're having a conversation. So when I'm communicating as I am right now, I'm sending words and I'm intending to make a point. You are receiving them. And so I need to be aware if you're receiving them with the intention that I had. Because
Mhm.
if you didn't, good chance that I'm, back to taking responsibility. Good chance it's not your fault, it's my fault. Meaning I intended to say A, you heard B, I probably didn't communicate A very well. And that concept has helped me a lot.
That's a huge problem, what you're talking about, and we have so many misunderstandings with each other, and we make so many assumptions about what the other person is understanding, what the other person's thinking, and the communication sort of framework I work with is called nonviolent communication. It's just a particular style, it's not the only one, but it's the one I know about and I really, really like. There is a part of the communication process where we check in with each other and we basically make a request for understanding. I said something to him and then I'll say, and Bernie, would you mind letting me know what you understood from what I just said? And that part's so important because you're right. Otherwise, you might walk away thinking you were perfectly clear
Hmm.
and you may not have been. So
Exactly.
yeah, it's really important.
Okay. We've covered a lot of important skills here. Are there any others that we need to know about for relationships?
Those are kind of those are the big buckets. And, there's so many techniques and strategies and building blocks to get to a place of being a great communicator and being able to regulate your emotions and take responsibility. But I would say those are the big buckets we've
And
talked
I'm
about.
wondering when you work as a relationship and communication coach, and I love the fact that you've got both relationship and communication in your identity role because they go together, right? As we've just been discussing.
Oh,
I'm
hugely.
wondering because this is what's running through my mind, Adele, and that is I'm asking myself, are these skills or are they habits? And I'm not here like argue the semantics, but I'm just wondering from the work that you do with clients is do people generally think of these as skills? Do they embrace them as skills or do they embrace them as lifestyle or habits or whatever the vernacular might be?
Good question. I'm actually, I'm kind of obsessed with habits. And I started my coach training actually as a health coach. And it was all about helping people build healthy habits. And so when I started working with relationships, I thought, oh, We need healthy habits in relationships just like we do around our health, right? You just like if you've got in a habit of going to the gym every day and eating a certain, and going to bed at a certain time. And really, that's a problem in our relationship. We have bad habits. So I like that you picked up on that. So I think about it, a skill might be something you learn. So if you think about driving, right? When you don't know how to drive, you first have to develop the skill of driving. And when you're first learning something new, it's clunky and you have to I remember when I learned to drive, I would have to think about it every time I pulled up to the intersection, like which side is the blinker? Which and it's clunky. But then after a while, you drive for many years, you don't have to think about it anymore. It does become a habit. So the skill then becomes a habit. So I think those terms are kind of interchangeable. I'm just thinking about a skill as something like we're teaching, and then hopefully you practice the skill enough time that it becomes a habit.
Thank you for that distinction, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. You do
Yeah.
have to develop a skill, and then it becomes a habit. Good. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I just building on that for a second, one thing I emphasize with my clients is this isn't like we're going to therapy once a week and you talk and that's it. Or, you go to church once a week and then you forget everything for the rest of the week. That doesn't work because I do want them to learn a habit. So part of what I really emphasize with my clients is helping them practice. So I give them some kind of practice every day. We practice together, they practice with each other, they practice on their own because otherwise you're going to never learn the skill. It's never going to become a habit.
So you give them homework.
I do give them correct.
Do you
Correct.
grade them?
Absolutely not, no. And,
Well, okay,
it's
I didn't mean it literally, being a little facetious, but I mean, you have conversation about it, right?
Oh, of course. So part of what I think the distinction between coaching and traditional therapy is, coaches hold their clients accountable. And what use is it for us to learn something new if they're gonna not do it and then come back the next week and start on something else? So, I do hold them accountable. I don't beat them up, but if something doesn't they say, "Oh, I didn't do my thing this week," then we'll talk about it. Okay, well, what was preventing you from doing it? What was that resistance about? And maybe it's as simple as they need to structure their day differently so they get to bed early, so then they can wake up early and do their meditation or their whatever it was that they were supposed to be doing. But yeah, I helped them figure out what was standing in the way.
Okay, great. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I love this topic. This is a big topic because obviously relationships are everything in life, right? We just have so many relationships. Of course, we're primarily we've been talking about the main relationship between two people, whether it's a marriage or a significant other. And unfortunately, too many of those relationships fail. So you're doing great work, Adele. And I love the fact that you've got a very structured approach to it with training and helping a lot of people. So, why don't you tell my listener where they can connect with you, get into your world? If there's a particular resource you want to make them aware of, please share that.
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram. It's just my name at Adele Curran. Facebook is the same. My website, everything is just my name. My website is www.adelecurran.com. And on my website and also in my bio on Instagram, there's a free resource that is really kind of an introduction to this communication style I'm talking about. It's basically about how to ask your partner for what you really need and doing that, in a way that's more likely to build connection than distance, which is what often happens. So, yeah, would love to connect with any of you who listened to this and found it intriguing.
Fantastic. Well, Adele, my listener knows that all that will be linked up in the show notes for this episode. And I just want to thank you for coming on this episode of the Life Fulfilled podcast and sharing your wisdom, your insights on relationship management and the skills that we need to manage our relationships. So thank you so much, Adele.
Thanks so much for having me.